Hello, everyone, and welcome to Orthodoxy. My name is Andy Schmidt, and I'm excited for this podcast. But before we get into it, I want to tell you about something. So about a year and a half ago, I started reading J.I. Packer. He's been a super influential theologian in my life. But the second book I read by him was a book called A Quest for Godliness. This book was J.I. Packer discussing the Puritans. Who are the Puritans? The Puritans were they're a group of Christians a couple hundred years ago. And they were super influential to modern Reformed theology and really influential to Western thought, modern Western thought. The Puritans were primarily focused on holiness, godliness, and purity. That's why they're called the Puritans. And they had some great theologians. One of the best theologians of all time, John Owen, has written on many different topics, but one of his most famous books, one of the most famous Christian books ever, is The Mortification of Sin by John Owen. These guys, the Puritans, were giants in theology. Actually, at the beginning of J.I. Packer's book, he talks about walking through the redwoods and how he looked up at these massive, huge redwood trees, and he talks about how that should be our attitude to reading the Puritans. They're these massive theological figures that we can look up to and that we should admire. And so what does this have to do with anything? Well, this has to do with the sponsorship for this podcast. If you want to start reading the Puritans and you don't know where to begin, Puritan Treasures for Today from Reformation Heritage Books makes the riches of these godly writers of old accessible for the modern reader. With the updated languages and helpful introductions, these classic works from John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and more are the perfect starting point for the curious reader. Learn more about the Puritan Treasures for Today at heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. If you use a coupon code Orthodoxy, you can get 10% off your order. That's heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures and use the coupon code Orthodoxy. Again, I can't stress this enough. The Puritans are theological giants. Everybody should read the Puritans. I'm reading the Puritans. I've read the Puritans. I love John Owen. He's a phenomenal theologian. And there's more than just John Owen in this set. It's a 14-volume set. It is not expensive. If you use that code Orthodoxy, you can get 10% off. This is totally worth your money. Go ahead and go to heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. That's heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. Use a coupon code Orthodoxy for 10% off. Okay, so let's move now into this podcast that I just did with Dr. Scott Jensen. Some people might be wondering, who is Dr. Scott Jensen? Well, I know Scott Jensen from being on his political campaign in 2022 when he ran to be the governor of Minnesota. Scott Jensen was a Republican running to be the governor of Minnesota. We lost the campaign, but Scott is super, super smart, very, very well-spoken doctor. He actually started as a doctor. He never was a politician until later on in his life. Then he decided he was in the Minnesota State Senate, and then he decided to run to be the governor of Minnesota in 2022. He ran against a guy named Tim Walz. Some people might know Tim Walz because Tim Walz is the vice president pick from Kamala Harris. And so Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are on the same ticket for the Democrats. And Tim Walz is a radical progressive. He is as radical as you can get on like any topic you can imagine: abortion, transgenderism, the economy. He's progressive. He is socialistic. I mean, he's even admitted to being these things. And so I thought when the pick was made by the Kamala campaign to have Tim Walz as the vice president, the vice president pick, I thought, I got to talk to Scott Jensen about this. He ran against him for 2 years. He campaigned against him. He actually worked with him in the Senate when he was in the Minnesota State Senate. Even before that, he's debated Tim Walz. And so there's very few people in the country that actually know Tim Walz the way that Scott Jensen knows Tim Walz. There's very few Republicans who know Tim Walz the way Scott Jensen knows Tim Walz. And I think that Scott has some seriously good insight. And I'm excited for you to listen to this podcast that I did with him. I want to say this beforehand. People might be wondering, well, why is this important to a podcast on theology? Well, Orthodoxy isn't just a podcast on theology. Orthodoxy is a podcast on Orthodox Christian belief producing orthopraxy, right practice, right living. How do we live out our Christian faith in the actual real world that we're in? Politics is part of that. And the presidential election is coming up here in November. I think it's important that we know who is on each ticket. And I have a special connection with Dr. Scott Jensen, who ran against Tim Walz. So I thought it would be great to have him on the podcast to actually learn a little bit about who Tim Walz is, what he believes, and why he would be a horrific vice president for the United States of America. But that's why we're doing this. It was a fantastic conversation. Scott and I talked about who Tim Walz is, what he believes in, or how we can actually know what he believes in. And then Scott brings up a really interesting essay by Dietrich Bonhoeffer about evil and stupidity, where Bonhoeffer argues that stupidity is worse than evil. And so that was really interesting, and we'll learn a little bit about that. Scott brings a little bit of theology, a little bit of politics, and it was a great conversation. I had him for 30 minutes. It was awesome. I really hope you enjoy. All right, everybody. I'm here with Dr. Scott Jensen. This is kind of weird for me because Scott and I, we know each other because I was on his political campaign in 2022 when he ran to be the governor of Minnesota. So it feels like this is a bit of a throwback. We used to do podcasts with each other all the time. But before we get into the discussion here, Scott, you want to tell people a little bit about yourself, who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm a small town kid. I grew up in Sleepy, Minnesota, and I was one of 5 kids. And pretty typical, I think. It takes a village to raise a child, and there were 3,500 people in Sleepy. My dad was my hero. My mom was my best friend. Unfortunately, Mom died in her late 40s of colon cancer, and I was about 21 years old at that time. So that was a devastating loss for me. Right around that time, I was going through that process of trying to find what career I wanted to go with. And so I was in dental school, and I decided that I really wasn't that enthralled with teeth. So I took a year off and went to the seminary. And in that year, I made 2 big decisions. I made the decision to ask my girlfriend to marry me, and she and I have been now married 46 years. And I also decided to go into medicine. And being a family doctor has been just an absolute privilege. And so that's sort of my background. I practiced medicine in Watertown, Minnesota. I started my own clinic about 25 years ago. We've got 2 clinics now, and there are about almost 10 providers. Wow. We've been extremely fortunate, very blessed. I think a lot of my life has been guided by the verse in Esther 4:14. Have you considered you're in the position you're in for such a time as this? I'm grateful for that. I didn't see myself being a politician because I was so happy with medicine. But in 2015, I was recruited to run for the Senate. And so I did that, and I was in the Minnesota Senate for 4 years. And that was both instructive as well as disillusioning. I really got a chance to, if you will, see how the sausage was made. And truly, it was an ugly process. Right. There was very little intellectual curiosity. I really don't think there's a lot of authenticity. I would love to tell people that their public servants who are elected are authentic, but quite frankly, I think one legislator told me that what you have to do in terms of your priorities is first and foremost, focus on your next election. Secondly, focus on your own convictions. And thirdly, pay attention to your constituents. It seems like that's sort of mixed up.
Yeah, it's backwards.
I would think that your convictions should be number 1, and your constituents should be number 2, and a repeat election should be down the road some. And you know, Andy, that's probably not a bad segue into a discussion about Tim Walz, because people have asked me, what do I see when I see Tim Walz? And I usually say, well, first, let me tell you how I worked with him. I was in the Senate when he was governor for his first 2 years. I was the lead chief author in the Senate on the insulin bill. And that was in 2020. And it was a Republican Senate. I was the chief author. A Democratic House. Mike Howard was the chief author, Democrat. And of course, Tim Walz was the Democratic governor. And I remember getting a message from Governor Walz's staff saying that he would like to have a meeting with me. The bill was bogging down. So we met in his office and had a productive 30-minute meeting or so. And I found him engaging. I enjoyed the meeting. It was straightforward, not a lot of doublespeak. And we got that bill done. So that was really my experience up to February of 2020, February and into March. But in March of 2020 is when the hammer came down and the first lockdown was put in place on March 17th. And I think that was where we really started to see a different side of Tim Walz. Then I finished up my term in the Senate and did not run for re-election. And then I decided I was recruited to run for governor. And so I said yes. And so I campaigned for almost 2 years. And so I got a chance to see another side of Tim Walz. And my summary response in a nutshell would be, what you get with Tim Walz is what I would call a Teflon politician. This is someone who, regardless of what kind of gaffe or mistake he makes, what kind of delay in judgment, what kind of turnabout in judgment he engages in, it won't stick. He and his team are very talented at getting things to slide away and get swept under the rug. I think that on the issues of inflation, crime, education, energy independence, immigration policies, consumer protection, corporate responsibility, you're not going to see a lot of leading because he's usually going to be more inclined to follow and stay safe. I think that you're going to see an expectation on his part, and it's justifiably there, in that the Minnesota mainstream media will protect Tim Walz, but also the DFL machine. And Walz got pretty darn comfortable having that protectorate. And they were like his shield. So if someone went after Tim Walz, not only would perhaps the largest newspaper in Minnesota go to his defense, they would literally serve as his attack dog.
Yeah.
I also think that with Tim Walz, you'll get frequently answers to questions that resemble more of a word salad than a cogent, concise response that's policy driven. I think that in that way, he'll sort of seem like everybody's favorite uncle, and he'll sort of bloviate, get wordy and windy. But within that, if you will, facade, he has really got a certain wolf in sheep's clothing tenacity. Because if you cross him, he will come at you hard, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, or whether you were perhaps a lobbyist group that thought that Tim Walz was with you. Take the NRA, for instance. Tim Walz turned pretty hard on the NRA and his position of being a Second Amendment supporter.
Yeah, right.
But I think you'll also get with Tim Walz a lack of accountability. He would rather let the news cycle expend itself as quickly as possible rather than take on whether $250 million were wasted in feeding our future program, the fraud that went with it. So you're not going to get a lot of accountability. On law and order, not so much, because Tim is pretty friendly with people who have been focusing on, at times, the Black Lives Matter movement,
right? Also
the defund the police.
Yeah.
Walz was pretty chummy with those folks. And lastly, I don't think that you're going to get Tim Walz responding to the challenges of the day with a fabric of convictions driving his comments. You're going to get more of a zeitgeist kind of a politician. You're going to get someone who sort of licks his finger and holds his finger up to see which way the wind is blowing.
Right.
Tim Walz wants to know, what's the feeling out there today? What's the tone of the culture? Where do they want me to move? You're not going to see that kind of fabric of what Ronald Reagan brought to the table, or if you wanted to take a theologian, a Dietrich Bonhoeffer or a C.S. Lewis. These people knew what their true north was and is in some of those situations. Not so with Tim Walz. He can be as nimble as he needs to be. And in so doing, I think that's a summation, Andy, that I would give you regarding Tim Walz.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to go back to your politician hierarchy, right? Conviction, constituents, and then reelection. the big question that people are trying to figure out, I think, with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz is what is their convictions? Do they have any convictions? Because the only thing that Kamala Harris seems to be convicted about is abortion, I guess, and letting anybody come through the southern border who wants to. So what do you see for Tim Walz as his conviction? This might be an impossible question to answer because a lot of these modern politicians are just doing whatever is going to help them win. But do you see him having any particular North Star at all? Is he going in any particular direction?
I think it's always dangerous for one person to try to identify with any kind of precision someone else's motivations. So I'm going to probably shy away from trying to tell you why Tim Walz does what he does. But I think you can look at this. You can look at his initial track record when he ran for Congress in southern Minnesota in 2006. He was a powerful Second Amendment supporter. Yeah. He was given an A rating by the NRA, endorsed by them, and they forwarded thousands of dollars to him. But when he ran for governor, now he knew that statewide, that position wasn't going to be tenable. So you saw him pivot pretty remarkably. Yeah. So I think, again, what that gets at is that lack of a set of really true convictions that just cannot be undercut. I think with Tim Walz, almost everything is negotiable because I think a lot of what he's about is about ambition. And I think it's about, if you will, the next step. And I think he likes control. He likes the idea of being in control. Quite frankly, one of the things I struggled with, Andy, when I was in the Senate was I didn't want to control other people's lives. I thought that the best way to get to the best place legislatively was to hammer out the common ground. Even if you were with someone who was diametrically opposed to your positions, spend an hour with them over coffee or even have a beer with them if you need to. But by George, try to find just a little kernel of common ground and then grow that. But always have this set of convictions that would be your true north. I don't think we've seen that with Tim Walz. And getting back to your question, Andy, why did Kamala Harris elect to choose Tim Walz? I think is because of that very reason. She felt that Governor Walz in some ways was a little bit like Gumby. You know, he could move and shape and he could bend. He didn't have this set of convictions that maybe Shapiro out of Pennsylvania had.
Right.
Walz, at the end of the day, is always negotiable. And I think that gave her comfort. And then she also made it clear that she liked the idea that he told her over and over again that he wasn't interested in running for president. And if you're willing to buy that, I think I can get you some swampland in Florida because I'm not buying that. But I think thirdly, Kamala Harris has very little to point to in terms of accomplishments, whether she looks at her U.S. Senate role or her vice presidency role. And so I think she's a little bit hesitant to bond with someone who might upstage her. And I think with Tim Walz, he's sort of a comfortable foil for her. He's not going to upstage her. He's not going to lock onto an issue and say, by George, this is where I got to draw a line in the sand. She's extremely comfortable that whatever happens, she can get Tim Walz wherever she needs to get him. And I think at the end of the day, that's really important. They're going to spend 100 days together. They're going to go through some tough times. And she's got a guy who can be Mr. Friendly, bloviate with the best, provide a word salad for 2 minutes and not answer the question. He can deflect with the best of them. He'll do all those things for her. And I think that made him a very, very comfortable choice.
Yeah, I mean, I was somewhat surprised when the news broke that that was the pick for Kamala, because I was like, well, we thought it was going to be Shapiro. I think not many people expected Walz, and then I started to think about it. I was like, actually, this makes a lot of sense here, because he kind of seems to be in a lot of ways the opposite of what JD Vance is. I think people were thinking JD Vance is going to be very favorable with the unions, and I think Tim Walz is going to be very favorable with the unions as well. I want to talk a little bit about Tim Walz's his outward appearance, because it's very deceptive, right? He kind of just seems like a Midwestern dad who's just a normal guy. You could go have a beer with him. He's totally regular guy, and it's kind of what you've been talking about a little bit. How can Americans begin to sift through this outward appearance compared to the inward more? This is actually like kind of what Tim Walz is actually going to do and what he actually believes in as a progressive. So there's this weird tension here, because he outwardly shows that he's this very charismatic, nice kind of Midwestern dad, but then inwardly, and as he's led Minnesota, has been incredibly progressive. How do people sift through that? That's a very difficult thing to do.
Well, I think that hopefully COVID gave us some practice at what we need to do. I think perhaps one of the best summations of what we're dealing with is, how do we parse out the difference between evil and stupid? Okay. Now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote an essay in 1943 about the nature of stupidity. And in it, he makes the case that the greatest danger isn't necessarily evil, because the nature of evil will have generally planted its own seed of subversion, but that the true dangerous enemy is stupidity. And in that, he goes into quite a bit of detail about the fact that when you're dealing with stupidity, there's no rational basis from which to approach it, because stupidity in and of itself is not rational. On the other hand, evil in its consummate sense can be very rational.
Yeah.
Some of the most evil perpetrators of crimes and murders have been extremely rational thinkers. Yeah. Point A to point B to point C, a logical sequence, creating an operational algorithm that allowed this heinous criminal to plod through a process whereby, whether it was Jack the Ripper or Dahman, it didn't matter. But with stupidity, it's so difficult to try to present a rational argument against it. And I think we sort of learned that during COVID. I mean, I don't mean to be picking on anybody here, but doesn't it seem like the ultimate zenith in stupidity to say that we should follow Tony Fauci's advice on COVID when he comes out recently and talks about his 6 vaccinations and his 3rd bout of COVID? And we want to say, yeah, he's the guy who should define science. If someone wants to take that position, how do you even begin to debate that? There's no rational logic to come from. So I really think that when we look at Tim Walz, we have to ask ourselves, in the world of politics, is not the most evil thing the one who indeed does pledge allegiance first and foremost to his or her own political career and their next political election? If that indeed is the most evil, then that may not be the most dangerous, because the most dangerous may be to not recognize stupidity. Yeah. And that's where I think the American people have got to land. Yeah. We have got to recognize that it would be absolutely stupid for us to underestimate our opponent. Do not underestimate Tim Walz. The guy can talk. He can put one word after the other. He can give you what sounds like a good answer until you step back and say, what did he just say? And realize it. He said nothing.
Right.
I think that this is the way America is going to get through this. We're going to say, okay, are we going to be stupid? Are we going to buy into this? Are we going to let the mainstream media let Walz and Harris skate? Harris not having a press conference where she has to answer on the spot questions coming from investigative journalists who know their stuff. I mean, in Minnesota, we get it. The media allowed Tim Walz to get to the 2022 general election day without one televised statewide debate for the first time in 40 years. And it was okay with the mainstream media in Minnesota. But the national media is already showing signs that they're not going to let that happen. They may have allowed a little too casually Joe Biden to hide in the basement in 2020 in the midst of COVID. Right. But we're not in COVID. And we've seen that card played before. And quite frankly, I don't think they're going to let Walz and Harris do that. So there's going to have to be some honest, excuse the phrase, come to Jesus moments here. We're all going to have to recognize that. And somewhere along the line, someone should ask Kamala Harris, you worked side by side with this guy for years and years and years. And when he stepped down because the powers that be in the Democratic Party said he is not up to the task, Kamala Harris violated what Tim Walz had told her when he came out from Minnesota to Washington, D.C., met with Biden for 45 minutes, told the press he's fit for service. Yeah. She knew Joe Biden for 3.5 years, and she didn't recognize what America saw on the night of the debate. I'm not buying that. I think the question has to be asked of Kamala Harris, what did you see? When did you see? When did you know it? And why did you not speak up? Why did you let Dean Phillips hang alone out there? He was absolutely ostracized, marginalized, and excoriated by the Democrats and the media for doing that, which ultimately was done by the entire political party, including Kamala Harris.
No, your point about that, I mean, that all is great. And your point about evil and stupidity is incredibly important. It actually reminds me of another theologian, G.K. Chesterton. He talks about if you want to see them, you want to talk to the most rational people in the world, go to the insane asylum. You know, these people, they're the most rational. They will have airtight arguments about everything, except for you step back for a second, you realize it's all crazy. And so absolutely fantastic point. I have two more questions that I want to ask you. One, do you think that Walz's interaction with and him dealing with or not dealing with the BLM riots of 2020, was that evil or stupid?
I think it was political. And I think perhaps the jury is still out whether it was evil or political. I think many politicians do indeed take actions that are political. And I think Tim Walz was trying to balance the support and energy of his activist base against the responsibility he had to lead. And I would say that his error was grievous. And I think that in retrospect, it looks incredibly stupid and hypocritical. Yeah. I mean, if you look at, he let thugs and people hell-bent on violence, a good share of them not even knowing what they were rioting about. They were hired hands. He let them have their way, not wear masks, get a free pass. And on the other hand, he took law-abiding citizens and told them they couldn't go to church, they couldn't bury their dead. And he came back and said, but I'm going to let you go into the biggest liquor stores, and I'm going to let you go to Menards, and you can all stand in the plumbing aisle. I mean, when you weigh this back and forth, this seems unbelievably stupid. But this is where Tim Walz was. And I think it's the nature of how he leads, which is to say, he doesn't lead. He tries to take that action of least resistance and then check out that zeitgeist moment. What should I do next? And so to me, when I see these videos of hundreds and thousands of rioters, no masks, and burning buildings one after another, and at the same time, the next day or week, we've got Tim Walz reminding people that he's now created a snitch line so that if you see too many of your neighbors standing on the deck grilling hamburgers, that call us and tell us who these people are, because so help us, we will criminalize these law-abiding people. This is what happened. I mean, this is one of the problems, Andy, with the human tendency to want to forget, is it's okay to forgive, and we should, but to forget, that allows us to not learn what we needed to learn. And what we went through was 2-3 years of horrific suppression of a free people by the government. How in the world can we take a casual attitude towards that?
Right. Totally. Yeah, totally agree. And I think obviously this all kind of leads into the big question. And I think the question that I want to ask you is, do you actually think that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have a chance against Trump and J.D. Vance? I think this is going to be a weird election. I mean, it's already turning out to be a crazy election year with the assassination attempt on Trump, and with Biden stepping down and then putting Kamala Harris. I mean, it's been wild. All of that leading up to November. What do you think is actually going to happen?
Well, I think, quite frankly, Harris and Walz have a very good chance of winning.
Sure.
And I think that as much as you can look at the accomplishments of President Trump during his term from 2017 to 20 and compare that to Biden, I mean, the economy, crime was down, education was in a way better place. Internationally, our standing was way better. We did stand as that bright, shining city on a hill. And then you fast forward and you look at where we're at now. If people would balance those two things, how you'd say, well, wow, I mean, what in the world would we be inclined to elevate if we're going to say Harris and Walz? But on the other hand, if people are going to look at, they're not willing to normalize the behavior that seems to be daily or weekly of denigrating a person's name or name calling or their heritage. I mean, I'm sorry, but I made this mistake too, where I got trapped into making comments that were not focused on the message that we should be focused on. And I feel bad that we did in our campaign make unforced errors, and that stops at my desk. That's on me. But I think that we need Trump and Vance they need to talk about the everyday issues that the everyday person's concerned about. And I can tell you what those are very easily. You're talking about inflation, crime, education, immigration policy, consumer protection, corporate responsibility, conservation of our resources, energy independence, our international standing, elevating faith, family, and freedom, standing for health freedom, standing for parental rights, limited government, lower taxes, trying to make sure everybody's got some skin in the game, recognizing that government does indeed have a role to play in terms of a safety net for folks, but it shouldn't be replacing their incentive to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. I mean, these are the things they need to be talking about. But right now, Trump and Vance are not simply running against Harris and Walz. They're running against mainstream media. They've got the European Union threatening Trump and Musk because they dared to have a discussion on X. I mean, this is international. The mainstream media will do anything they can. You can see it when they post a picture of Trump and Harris. They'll take a dignified look of Harris. They'll take one of the worst pictures they can find of Trump. If Harris had had a near miss assassination attempt like Trump had, this thing would be a hot issue still burning. But that news cycle is over. I mean, this is astonishing. The failure of the Secret Service to do their job. And this is in the past. This isn't even much more than a month old.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, do not undersell your opponent. Harris and Walz have a very good chance of winning. And if we don't keep our eye on the ball, we have a problem. And I'd like to say one other thing about President Trump. People have said that he has hijacked the party. I reject that outright.
Okay.
I think if you look at his big issues, what he has tried to do, some of those challenging paths that he has tried to navigate, I think you can stack him up to Ronald Reagan and talk about the elevation of faith, family, freedom, and the founding fathers' wisdom, limited government, stimulate the economy, lower taxes, celebrate exceptionalism, always be mindful of the individual liberty. Socialism and communism are a failed experiment. You get peace by being strong, not by begging for it. Be that bright, shining city on a hill. You put Trump against Reagan, you're looking at the same stuff. And Trump has had to deal with that very tough issue of how do we best honor life. And Trump is saying to the Republicans and the Democrats alike, okay, the Constitution, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, does not speak clearly to the issue of abortion, so it will be left to each of the states to decide. Trump has said that some states will decide more conservatively than others. He said, this is the way it has to be. And he has said, so be it. That doesn't mean that President Trump hasn't spent serious time trying to elevate the role of honoring life, streamlining adoption, doing a better job with natural family planning, trying to have birth control more available and more of a shared responsibility. I think Trump has made it very clear that this issue of how do we best honor life is not an issue that is before the American people now. The issues that face the American people are, will we be able to keep our democratic republic or not? And to me, that's all chips.
No, I could see that. And at some point, we should have another conversation about the abortion thing, because I go back and forth in my mind. I think there are a lot of issues right now that are incredibly important. You have the geopolitical. I mean, we're on the brink of like World War III in the geopolitical world. And so if we talk about saving life, I mean, that's one way in which I think Trump would save a lot of lives if he was a commander in chief of the United States, because I don't think we'd get into a World War III with Donald Trump. I honestly don't know with Kamala Harris. I don't know if she even has the capacity to understand the complexity of the geopolitical landscape. But we should talk about the abortion thing at some point, but I can't keep you here forever. I do appreciate you talking about this. I think that there's few people in the country who know as much about Tim Walz as you do, because you ran against him and you had to interact with him and you had to debate him. And so I think that your insights here are incredibly important. I think they're actually really, you make some really good points about stupidity and evil and things that the American people should really be thinking about as we move closer and closer to November. So Scott, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Andy. And thanks for having me on. And I probably would just close with the verse that I said before. I know this is frustrating time for so many people, but those words of Esther 4:14, when Mordecai challenged Esther, have you considered that you're in the position you're in for such a time as this? To me, what that really says is that every American needs to say, I'm not going to stand on the sidelines. As painful as it is, I'm going to walk into the arena and I'm going to engage my neighbor, my friends, my family. I'm going to try to get as balanced a viewpoint as I can, because my voice matters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. Scott, thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate it. If you're listening to this podcast and you like this, make sure you like, subscribe, share this with your friends, leave us a 5-star rating and a review, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.